Let's play the music. It's time once again for A Moment with Bob, brought to you by your friends at Offshore Drilling. Tonight's title of A Moment with Bob, A Big Ass Moment. It comes from the land beyond beyond. Hey, Mike, for all those interested, here's the answer to the question, why we left the United States. Because on December 12, 2000, the United States Supreme Court nullified the results of a national election and installed George W. Bush as president. And then I saw millions of my fellow Americans deliriously happy the rule of law was broken by the Supreme Court of the land, so their guy could win. And that's when I knew partisanship had ultimately won out over reality. More Americans believe in angels than election fraud. If millions of Americans could turn a blind eye to a stolen election simply because their side stole it, and then have that coup legitimized by not only the Supreme Court, but by all of mainstream media, then I knew the country I lived in was not the land of my birth. I can't emphasize this enough. Millions of Americans were ecstatic that George W. Bush won, regardless of how he won. Unquestioning blind partisanship was more important than the law to these people, but more ominous was mainstream media ratifying the coup. At that moment, corporate media proved they were committed to the destruction of our democratic republic. That was pretty scary to witness. We've all heard of similar ham-fisted tactics used in banana republics south of the border, but this was happening here. And that's when I began formulating my crazy stupid people theorem. Whoever thought the Supreme Court's decision was part and parcel with a normal transfer of power was either stupid, crazy, or evil. Americans who didn't know it was essentially a coup were either stupid or crazy, or a little bit of both. If anyone knew it was an outright theft of Americans' votes, and they were perfectly okay with that, well, what else could you call it other than evil? The subversion of our right to choose our elected representatives strikes at the heart of our country's founding principles. But again, and this is what continues to confound me, millions of Americans thought it was just fine and dandy. Along with millions of other sane Americans, I didn't move on. I could not understand why it was so important the institutions Americans trusted most to protect its freedoms and principles had crammed George W. Bush down our throats. Then, 234 days into Bush's first term as president, the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And from that day on, everything the Bush-Cheney regime did to distort and transform the United States of America into something unrecognizable was because of 9/11. It all came down to 9/11, period. The buck stopped there. And as we were all walking around in a daze, coated with the ash of human beings and pulverized concrete, we were spun into the ultimate war crime, wars of aggression. As Chris Hedges wrote, quote, "We became what we abhorred. The deaths were used to justify preemptive war, invasion, shock and awe, prolonged occupation, targeted assassinations, torture, offshore penal colonies, gunning down families at checkpoints, massive serial bombardments, drone attacks, missile strikes, and the killing of dozens, and soon hundreds, and then thousands, and later tens of thousands, and finally hundreds of thousands of innocent people." End quote. Then the dawning realization. The 9/11 trigger mechanism that caused hell on earth for the people of Afghanistan and Iraq was a grotesque lie. This was the ultimate horror piled upon horror. Hundreds upon hundreds of statements from members of the senior military and intelligence services, law enforcement, government officials, engineers, architects, pilots and aviation professionals, professors, 9/11 survivors and family members, artists, entertainers, media professionals. They're all on record saying the official account of 9/11 is false, impossible, a bunch of hogwash, total BS, ludicrous, a well-organized cover-up, a whitewashed farce, absurd, fatally flawed, not possible. The lies of the Bush-Cheney regime told us that led our country into the ultimate war crime were predicated upon the lies the government previously told us about the attacks of 9/11. As Ralph Lopez wrote, quote, "The biggest problem with the 9/11 truth movement is where it leads. A place dark and evil beyond imagination when hundreds of American military officers, pilots, engineers, and CIA veterans step forward to say they believe the official story to be a monstrous lie, I was shaken to the core. The conspiracies led to the deep, dark hole that we are ruled by criminal psychopaths." End quote. This is about as bad as it gets. We knew the government covered up how and why 3,000 people died on 9/11, and then went on to use the attacks as an excuse to do everything we find reprehensible today. And again, corporate media ran cover for the government. If we can't believe the government's cover-up, we're left with three options. Conclusion 1, they made it happen. Conclusion 2, they allowed it to happen. Or conclusion 3, the attacks of 9/11 were possible because of massive incompetence on the part of the Bush-Cheney regime. If incompetence is the least offensive rationale to explain the actions of the Bush-Cheney regime, then why has there been no accountability? Involuntary manslaughter is an unintentional killing that happens during the commission of a misdemeanor or because of gross negligence or carelessness. According to federal sentencing guidelines, involuntary manslaughter is punishable by 6 years in prison. Shouldn't someone, or a lot of someones, from the Bush-Cheney regime be prosecuted for the gross negligence that led to the deaths of almost 3,000 people? Not in post-9/11 America. But while we struggle to map out just exactly what a post-9/11 America looked like, another stolen presidential election knocked us to our knees. We knew it was stolen in Ohio. We knew how it was stolen. And once again, the corporate media buried the truth by ignoring it. And the blind, partisan, crazy, stupid people rejoiced in the prospect of 4 more years of the Bush-Cheney regime. Throughout it all, the majority of sane Americans made the same strategic blunder over and over and over again. We were used to signing petitions and having protest marches. We treated these people like they were politicians, but the Bush-Cheney gang were not politicians. They were gangsters and thugs. Politicians periodically bend to the will of the people. Thugs don't care. These people wipe their ass with petitions. When Dick Cheney was told that 2/3 of America said the war in Iraq was not worth it, Cheney replied, "So?" That's who we were dealing with. Gangsters who completely ignored the will of the people. We could write all we want and call all we want and demonstrate all we want, but by following their rules, we had the unlimited freedom to be ineffectual. The Republican machine, aided and abetted by corporate media, stole the presidency of the United States twice. Together, they started 2 wars and have killed over 1 million people. How could we think they would back off and play nice because we all wrote scathing emails and marched in protests? They were thugs. We were supposed to arrest thugs, put them on trial, and if guilty, put them in jail. But we didn't do that. We decided to hope instead. We hoped the Bush-Cheney regime wouldn't completely destroy the country before 2008. We hoped the same corrupt voting system that delivered us George W. Bush would magically allow us the autonomy to elect someone to save us from the evildoers. We hoped a constitutional law professor would restore the Constitution. But most of all, we hoped, for the first time in living memory, that a politician would deliver on his campaign promises. The policies of the Bush-Cheney regime are still in place under the Obama administration. We still have the wars of aggression and occupation. Innocent people are still killed every day. We still hold prisoners in Guantanamo Bay who, after almost 10 years, have yet to be charged or tried for any crime. The Bush-Cheney-Obama regimes have given away trillions of dollars to people who engineered the largest financial swindle in recorded history. And they, along with our honest-to-God war criminals, continue to walk free, unindicted, unaccountable, and above the law. As Michael in New York wrote to you in October of 2009, quote, "My belief is that the American system has lost its capacity for reform," end quote. I'll take that to the next step. The American system has lost its capacity to govern. Corporate interests under the guise of partisanship, über alles. And as Paul Craig Roberts wrote the other day, quote, Obama regime appointee Cass Sunstein, a Chicago and Harvard law school professor, thinks the 9/11 movement, for challenging the official truth, should be infiltrated by U.S. intelligence agents in order to shut down the fact-based doubters of government propaganda. When a law professor at our two most prestigious law schools wants to suppress scientific evidence that challenges government veracity, we know that in America, respect for truth is dead. The notion that a country in which truth is dead is a light unto the world is an absurdity. End quote. I find that nothing short of terrifying. And real solutions are non-existent. And so, after 10 long years, and finally having enough money, we left. It may be completely illusory, but it feels like we have a future here. It feels more substantial than hope. It feels like we have finally come home. Regards, Bob Alexander.